Louise's voice cut through the murmurs as she demanded to know what they had been talking about. The purple-haired knight faltered under her gaze, words stumbling as he tried to answer, before Louise pressed again, asking who had said something like that in the first place. Flustered, he hurried to explain that no one had spoken outright. It was merely a conclusion they had reached among themselves. He admitted that while it was a pleasure to have Miss Louise with them at all times, before she was their colleague, she was His Highness's lover. No matter how strong a person was, the battlefield was unpredictable, and His Highness must be concerned in many ways. The implications settled heavily. Louise asked, her expression stern and unyielding, whether that meant everyone was hoping she would step away. The knight panicked, rushing to deny it, but his words were cut short as Hendrik's voice rang out cheerfully from behind them, calling for Miss Louise and announcing with triumph that she had indeed come, just as he had said she would. He complained loudly that training had been unbearably dull without her. Louise turned toward him, murmuring that, as expected, Hendrik was the only one, and a small smile softened her face. Hendrik returned it instinctively, then paused, noticing something amiss. With forced brightness, he suggested that the weather was perfect for catching up, and proposed that instead of morning training, they take a walk around the village together. She agreed, and as they walked through the quiet streets, Louise told him everything that had happened earlier. Hendrik listened, then remarked that it seemed she had been quite disappointed by the others, though he couldn't say he failed to understand their reasoning. Louise asked if even he thought that way. Hendrik admitted that it was because everyone had grown fond of her. Despite already being skilled with the sword, she trained harder than anyone, always trying to help others, and all the team members said Miss Louise was amazing. Because they had come to realize how wonderful she was, they feared seeing her hurt or endangered during the expedition. The sincerity of his words left Louise speechless. Hendrik then added that His Highness seemed to hold a slightly different opinion. When Louise asked if he meant Edward, Hendrik confirmed it, explaining that early that morning, Edward had stopped by briefly and told him not to worry, no matter what choice Miss Louise made. Louise wondered aloud if that meant Edward also wanted her to stay behind. Hendrik shook his head, saying that Sir Edward was always clear with his orders. If he truly wanted her to remain, he would have left without saying a word. Louise muttered that such bluntness was harsh, and inwardly she reeled, unable to believe Edward had said something like that. She had always thought he was only ever thinking of leaving her behind. Hendrik continued quietly, explaining that for people like them, it was a far greater decision than she realized. When Louise asked what he meant, Hendrik confessed that his own training to help her and his desire for her to stay were born of cowardice. Knights like them trembled at the thought of losing someone close, and the one who felt that fear most strongly, he said, was surely His Highness. As he spoke, Louise lifted her gaze and froze. Edward stood ahead of them. Her thoughts whispered his name as he walked toward them. He greeted her lightly, remarking with a smile that while he had been momentarily distracted, she seemed to have gone on a date with Hendrik. Louise quickly explained they had merely gone for a morning walk to explore the village. Edward replied that he would usually call that a date. Taking advantage of the moment, Hendrik laughed nervously and announced that something urgent had suddenly come up, and he would head back first. Louise instinctively moved to follow him, but Edward reached out and caught her hand, telling her to stay. She protested that it had been Edward who left her behind. He replied that he had planned to come back for her after breakfast. When she pointed out that he had been here all along, he said he had come looking for her because she was here, though he hadn't known she was with Hendrik. Louise realized then, glancing at the necklace she wore, that it must be how he knew her whereabouts. Edward confirmed it, adding that it did not mean he intended to invade her privacy, and asked her to keep wearing it during the expedition. She agreed, then hurried to clarify that there had been a misunderstanding. Hendrik had only been trying to cheer her up. When she woke that morning, Edward was gone, Maction still asleep, and it felt as though everyone wanted her left behind. Hendrik said it wasn't true, but she had begun to wonder if Edward felt the same. She asked him directly whether he wanted her to stay behind like the others did. Edward asked if he could be honest. When she agreed, he asked her to promise she wouldn't run away before hearing his answer. Confused, she protested that even if she tried, Edward could simply catch her. He sighed that he hoped she wouldn't use that against him, and she insisted she was only being honest. Edward leaned closer, smiling, until the space between their faces narrowed and both of them began to blush. He leaned in further and whispered something into her ear. Louise recoiled in flustered disbelief, asking what that meant and why she would. Edward? He only told her to take some time to think about it, then suggested that since the day's schedule was free, they explore the village and have a meal together. Louise protested that they couldn't possibly be free. They still needed to find a way to break Maxion's dark magic. Edward calmly said that he had already found the answer. When she stared at him in shock, he asked, almost casually, if she could make him an apple pie. The scene shifted to the kitchen, where Louise stood with oversized oven mitts, carefully baking the apple pie he had requested. In her thoughts, doubt crept in. She had really made it. But was this truly the answer to waking Maxion? A memory surfaced, Edward speaking to her earlier as they walked through the village. He had asked whether she had ever lost someone she cared deeply about, whether an object or a person. She had answered that of course she had, and asked why. Edward had explained that those afflicted by dark magic all shared a profound sense of loss. One woman had fallen asleep the day her only daughter left on a journey and awakened the day she returned. Another had succumbed after his beloved potted plant wilted. The Marquis of Serbenia himself had awakened when his wife brought back the same kind of plant he had lost. Louise had asked then why Maxion had fallen asleep, since he hadn't lost anything during the expedition. Edward replied that he had thought about what Maxion might have been thinking, and that was why they needed the apple pie. It was Maxion's favorite food. Back in the present, Louise carried the finished pie toward Maxion's room. Edward knew Maxion liked apple pie, she realized. If Edward knew that, then Maxion must have liked it even when they were apart. It had been the only thing she could ever make for him. At the door, she found Edward waiting. She noted that he must have planned to go in together, but Edward said he would only be a bother. He would wait outside and asked her to call him when Maxion woke. Louise insisted he wouldn't be a bother, but accepted his choice and handed him a slice of pie to eat while waiting. He thanked her quietly. Edward stared at the pie in silence as Louise entered the room. She sat beside Maxion and set the pie on the table. He was still asleep. Edward had said it might help to remind him of the past. Something must have hurt him deeply for those memories to become so vivid. She spoke softly, telling Maxion she had twisted her ankle again while playing. There was no response. She continued, saying she needed to bathe, but had no one to look after her, asking if he was angry and begging his forgiveness if she had done something wrong. She told him she had even brought apple pie. She lifted a slice toward him, reminding him how much he liked it, how she always made it for their anniversaries or whenever he was upset. Inside, fear surged. What if this didn't work? If it was something he could no longer obtain, would he sleep forever, just like back then, 10 years ago? Was he trying to leave her again? She called his name and began to shake him, pleading for him to wake up, tears spilling as she confessed how happy she had been to see him again, how he couldn't just run away like this. She had been waiting for him. Her thoughts echoed the old promise. He had said he would stop by sometime, that he would come tell her any news. She sobbed that she was waiting for him like this again. Then Maxion stirred. He opened his eyes and asked quietly what was wrong with her ankle. He sat up and gently wiped away the tear poised on her cheek, asking why she was crying. Louise could only stare at him in stunned disbelief. Maxion was finally awake. At first, Louise could only let out a small, disbelieving sound as she stared at Maxion. The realization that he was truly awake struck her all at once, and before she could say anything else, her composure crumbled. Tears welled up again, this time not from fear, but from overwhelming relief, and she cried silently as she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him. The suddenness of the embrace caught Maxion off guard, and he stiffened slightly, murmuring her name in confusion, as if he were still unsure whether this was real. Louise clung to him tightly and, between quiet sobs, asked if he had any idea how many days he had been asleep. Maxion blinked, genuinely surprised, and wondered aloud whether it had truly been that long. When she told him it had been 3 full days, he let out a small sigh of understanding, admitting that it explained why his body felt so unbearably heavy upon waking. As that realization settled in, a faint blush crept onto his cheeks. Still holding on to him, Louise quickly asked if he was hungry. When Maxion answered honestly that he was, she immediately shoved a slice of apple pie into his mouth without hesitation. He made a muffled, startled sound in protest, crumbs scattering as he struggled to chew. Watching his reaction, Louise's expression shifted, and she suddenly accused him of being upset with her. The words seemed to catch Maxion off guard just as much as the pie, and he reacted instinctively, denying it without thinking. Louise, however, refused to accept that answer. With a firm gaze, she told him not to lie, insisting that she had never left him, so she needed to know why he had felt such a deep sense of loss. The question stunned him, especially as he was still wiping apple pie crumbs from his face with his hand, confusion written plainly across his expression. Unable to answer right away, Maxion listened as Louise carefully explained everything that had happened, how Edward had analyzed the dark magic, how the apple pie had been part of the plan, and how frightened she had been while waiting for him to wake. By the time she finished, Maxion could only respond quietly, finally understanding the situation. Louise pressed further, her voice trembling as she demanded the truth. She told him how terrified she had been, thinking he might never open his eyes again, and begged him to be honest with her. After a long pause, Maxion admitted what he had been feeling. He confessed that it had seemed as though he no longer had a place by her side, that she had once belonged only to him, and that this feeling had gnawed at him deeply. As he spoke, his hands clenched into fists, the emotion behind his words unmistakable. He explained that in the past, he had been the only one standing beside her, but now that had changed, and that difference was what had upset him so deeply. Louise said nothing at first. Instead, she abruptly raised her hand and struck him on the head hard enough to make him cry out in pain. Then, with tears streaming down her face, she scolded him fiercely, telling him to listen carefully. She declared that no one could ever replace him, that he would always have a place in her heart no matter how many people entered her life. She promised that this would never change, and swore that she would make sure he never felt that kind of pain again. If he ever felt hurt, she demanded that he tell her instead of falling victim to such dangerous magic. Maxion fell silent, absorbing her words. Inside his mind, he reflected on how her world had grown so much larger compared to the days when it had been just the two of them. He had believed that her gaze would never return to him, wondering bitterly if he had made his decision too hastily. Yet now he realized the truth, that the one with the unchanging heart had always been Louise. With that realization, he finally nodded and agreed softly. At that moment, Edward entered the room, greeting Maxion cheerfully and asking if he had enjoyed his dream. Louise froze, suddenly aware of how tear-streaked her face must look, and hurriedly wiped at her cheeks in embarrassment, thinking desperately that she must look like a mess. Edward simply smiled, expressing his relief at seeing Maxion awake. Louise apologized for being so distracted that she had forgotten to call him, but Edward brushed it off, reassuring her that it was understandable. Believing her role was finished now that Maxion was awake and Edward had checked on him, Louise announced that she would return to her room. The declaration startled Maxion. As she stood up and turned to leave, he reached out and grabbed her hand, stopping her. He asked her not to go and insisted that she stay a little longer. Louise hesitated, self-conscious about her swollen eyes and tear-stained face, but Edward calmly offered her a handkerchief. Grateful, she accepted it, wiping her face carefully. As she did, Edward glanced at her with a faint smirk, his cheeks tinged with color, while Maxion watched the exchange in confusion. Trying to shift the atmosphere, Maxion asked how long Edward had been awake. Edward answered casually that he had been awake the entire time Maxion was asleep. Louise immediately protested, shocked that Edward hadn't slept for 3 days, especially since his complexion looked so good. Maxion jokingly suggested that Edward must have taken a potion to alter his appearance, and Edward admitted that this was true. Louise suddenly understood why Edward had been waking up so early each morning and insisted on examining him herself. Without hesitation, she leaned in and touched Edward's face, carefully inspecting his skin and pressing her hand to his forehead while muttering about possible side effects, particularly psychological ones. Edward allowed her to do so without complaint, blushing silently the entire time. Watching the scene unfold, Maxion abruptly asked both of them to leave, claiming that he suddenly wanted to be alone. The request made them flinch and turn away from each other awkwardly. Edward agreed to summon a servant to call a doctor to check on Maxion, while Louise hurriedly announced that she should return to her room, still embarrassed about her face. She warned Maxion jokingly that if he fell asleep again, he would be in serious trouble. Maxion replied lightly, telling her he would see her tomorrow. As Louise left, Maxion lay back on his bed, folding his hands behind his head. In his thoughts, he compared the scene he had just witnessed to watching his beloved younger sister's romance unfold. Almost immediately, he corrected himself. Louise meant far more to him than that. She was his family, his childhood friend, and something more. The realization struck him clearly at last. She had been his first love. In truth, she was the only person he could ever truly call that. His thoughts drifted further back, to the circumstances of his birth. Maxion had been the son of the northern family's heir, Caliad, born to a mistress. Before a marriage could ever take place, his pregnant mother had fled and lived in hiding within a small territory owned by a baron. When Maxion was 5 years old, she took him to the front of the inn where they were staying and asked him to wait patiently with his uncle, promising she would return soon. That was the last time he ever saw her. From the age of 8, Maxion worked at the inn to survive. One day, a mercenary took notice of his strong build and sharp mind, remarking that he would become a useful warrior someday. Eventually, a mercenary group took him in, and for the first time, he left the inn and traveled south with them due to an epidemic spreading through the north. As they walked through the forest, young Maxion asked what kind of job they were taking on next. The mercenary explained that they were searching for the runaway son of a noble family, and that Maxion bore a resemblance to him. Though the area was dangerous, the payment would be generous. The mercenary ruffled Maxion's hair, promising him something delicious if everything went well, and urged him onward. Despite moments of kindness, that journey soon turned into a nightmare. Deeper in the forest, they encountered a ferocious beast. Maxion heard the mercenaries scream in terror, begging for help. One of them shouted at Maxion to run, and he obeyed, fleeing as fast as his legs would carry him, while screams and the sound of blood filled the air behind him. Desperate to survive, he hid beneath a fallen mercenary's body, sobbing quietly as he tried to stay unnoticed. The beast's growls echoed nearby, and Maxion covered his mouth to keep from making a sound. In his mind, he accepted what he thought was his fate, praying desperately to anyone who might hear him, begging the forest god, or anyone at all, to save him just once. When he looked up, his heart nearly stopped as he realized the beast had found him. It raised its claws to strike. Maxion curled into himself and shut his eyes, bracing for death. Instead, when he opened them again, he was alive. Standing before him was a girl who had slain the beast with her sword. The memory remained as vivid as ever. Even now, in the present, Maxion could see it clearly. The figure that shone brightly in the darkness of the forest, approaching him like a blessing sent by the gods themselves. Louise sheathed her sword the moment the beast fell, her sharp gaze immediately turning toward the boy on the ground. She asked if he was alive, and whether he was hurt anywhere, her voice steady despite what had just happened. Maxion could only answer that he wasn't injured, still stunned and struggling to process the fact that he was alive. Relief flickered across her face, and she asked if he could stand, extending her hand to help him up. As he stared at her outstretched hand, Maxion realized that this was the first time he had ever met Louise. Before he could fully rise, she spoke again, casually telling him that he would need to carry her around for a while. The request shocked him into blurting out his confusion, but she immediately winced, explaining that she had twisted her ankle while kicking the bear away. It was already starting to swell. There was no time to waste. She insisted they needed to call her mother so they could save the others. Then, noticing his tear-streaked face, she scolded him lightly and told him to wipe his tears away, calling him a crybaby without malice. Obediently, Maxion nodded. He lifted her onto his back, wiping his eyes as he did so, and began carrying her toward her home. Louise directed him with confidence, pointing out the path and telling him to turn right at a specific tree. He responded between labored breaths, exhausted but determined, and eventually managed to bring her safely back to the house. Two people were waiting outside. Louise's mother immediately scolded her for entering the forest again without saying anything, while Louise explained that she had seen people heading into the woods from the hill. Blackie had been going there frequently lately, and she couldn't simply ignore it. Hearing the name, Maxion froze internally, realizing with disbelief that the terrifying beast he had encountered was casually called Blackie. Her father joined the conversation, warning her that she would get into serious trouble before asking if she was hurt. When she admitted that she had twisted her ankle, he coughed and bent down to examine it, then finally turned his attention to Maxion, asking who the boy was. Louise answered without hesitation, saying she had picked him up among the fallen. The phrasing made Maxion blink in confusion, repeating the words silently to himself. Her father, unfazed, suggested they examine the wound first and asked Maxion to put Louise down. He complied, and once Louise was seated, her father carefully checked her ankle. Louise, still thinking of the others, urgently reminded them that there were many injured people near Puron village. Her father responded with a calm, almost bored enthusiasm, remarking that it had been a while since anything had happened. Louise's mother sighed, calling it annoying. Throughout the exchange, Maxion watched the family in quiet awe. Their warmth, their casual familiarity with danger. It all felt unreal. He wondered if they were even human at all, half convinced that they might be forest fairies. Eventually, Louise's father turned to him and asked his name. Maxion introduced himself, and the man observed that, judging by his appearance and speech, he must be from the north. He asked who was taking care of him. Maxion answered simply that the person responsible for him had just died. The man's expression softened as he asked whether Maxion had somewhere to return to. The question struck deeply. Maxion realized he had nowhere to go. The captain who had cared for him the most was dead, and if he returned to the remaining mercenaries, they might abandon him again. For the first time, the truth became undeniable. He truly had no place to belong. As the adult spoke, Louise suddenly asked her father if she could go out again. He immediately refused, insisting she rest until her ankle healed. Frustrated, she complained openly. Without thinking, Maxion offered to carry her wherever she needed to go. The unexpected declaration stunned both Louise and her father. They stared at each other for a moment, then burst into laughter. Louise's father remarked that she had brought home an interesting friend, and Louise agreed proudly. Her mother, amused but practical, pointed out that their house didn't have many rooms, meaning the two would have to share one. She warned Maxion jokingly that if he did anything foolish, Louise might accidentally hurt him in her sleep. Maxion accepted the conditions quietly. When her mother asked if Louise was okay with the arrangement, she answered enthusiastically. With that settled, Louise's mother instructed Maxion to take good care of her daughter while he stayed. It was in that moment that Maxion realized his life in perils had begun. He adapted quickly, nurtured by the kindness he was shown, and at the same time, he became aware of something unfamiliar blooming in his chest, his first love. Time passed, and Maxion found himself admiring Louise constantly. One day, he murmured that something was beautiful. When she asked what he meant, he answered honestly, praising her eyes, her hands, her hair, even her breath, declaring everything about her beautiful. Louise recoiled in exaggerated disgust, calling him gross. In his heart, Maxion understood that what he felt wasn't quite love yet. It was closer to worship. His devotion manifested in strange ways. When they encountered a puddle, he dropped to the ground and offered himself as a stepping stone, urging her to walk across him. Louise stared at him in disbelief, asking what was wrong with him. He answered solemnly that he was simply showing his sincerity as a humble human. From a distance, Louise's parents laughed, her father remarking that the boy seemed to be laboring under a misunderstanding. A month later, Maxion learned the truth, that Louise and her family were neither forest fairies nor gods. The revelation shocked him completely. Louise's mother laughed uncontrollably at his reaction, while Maxion struggled to accept how ordinary humans could live in such a dangerous, mysterious place. Still laughing, her mother asked whether he liked Louise even knowing she wasn't some divine being. Embarrassed but honest, Maxion admitted that he did. Satisfied, she offered to teach him how to use a sword, explaining that if he wanted to stay by Louise's side, he needed to protect himself. From that day on, Maxion trained under both parents. Louise trained as well, learning swordsmanship and her father's healing techniques. The years passed swiftly. Winter festivals, childish fights, reconciliations, and countless happy days. Then came the winter when they turned 12. Louise's father, sensing his time was short, gathered them and announced that the final thing he would teach them was a secret family technique, the ability to listen to the voice of the departed. Maxion hesitated, asking whether he was truly allowed to learn it. Louise, already crying, listened closely as her father assured them it wasn't anything special and didn't work for everyone. He told Maxion that he was family. The word lingered heavily in Maxion's heart. The technique, he explained, was simple. After saying goodbye to someone you loved, you returned to your happiest memories with them and held a conversation. Reenacting those moments could help as well. Louise protested, saying it would only make her sadder, but her father gently corrected her. Regret always followed loss, he said, the regret of not loving enough. Instead of blaming one another, it was important to cherish the happiness they had shared. He told her he was proud of her, apologized for not knowing how to express himself better, and told her he loved her. Louise broke down completely and rushed forward, hugging him tightly. He spoke softly about how the past paved the way while the future set the direction, and how people lived by walking atop their memories toward tomorrow. Louise admitted she didn't understand difficult words and begged him not to leave, insisting she didn't need anyone else as long as he stayed. Later, after Louise's mother took her away to calm her down, her father asked Maxion whether he would someday leave this place. He explained that while his wife believed Maxion would stay by Louise's side forever, he did not. If Maxion ever left, he wanted him to leave alone. If Louise ever left and fell ill, she would need to return to recover. When Maxion asked why, her father told him that once Louise reached the age where she could leave, he should dig beneath the rock in the backyard. Only then would he understand. Before standing, he patted Maxion's head and praised him, saying he seemed dependable despite his youth and asking him to take good care of the women in the house for as long as he stayed. A few days later, Louise's father passed away quietly, as if he had fallen into a deep sleep. Maxion stayed by Louise's side, comforting her through her grief. After that loss, something inside Maxion changed. He stopped blushing around Louise. The fluttering excitement gave way to something heavier and stronger, the need to protect her. Years passed again. Maxion grew into a teenager. One autumn day, Louise's mother asked him to wait while she fetched something. As he stood alone, observing the changing leaves, a stranger called his name. When Maxion confirmed it, the man remarked that he resembled his father. The words shook him. He had always believed his father had died before he was born. When Maxion asked if the stranger knew his father, the man confirmed it, explaining that he had been searching the South for several years. He revealed the truth, that Maxion's parents had lied to him, and that now, both his mother and his father, Count Caliod, were waiting for him. The revelation left Maxion stunned. "They're waiting for me?" And with that question, his past and future collided. Maxion stiffened when the stranger spoke his name. The man acknowledged him calmly, introducing himself as Amon de Berg, and explaining that Maxion was the successor of Count Caliod. He apologized for arriving so late and, as proof of his loyalty to the Caliod family, produced a letter sealed with the family crest. According to him, the Count had prepared a reward for whoever found Maxion and had ordered that the young master be brought back safely. The words felt unreal. Caliod. Father. Mother. None of it made sense. Maxion watched the man carefully, suspicion tightening in his chest, yet something about the letter unsettled him enough to hesitate. Before he could say anything, Louise's mother returned and stopped short when she saw the unfamiliar figure standing near Maxion. Her eyes narrowed immediately, and she demanded to know who the frightening-looking man was supposed to be. Eamon reacted with visible irritation, remarking that despite her lowly southern appearance, her speech was unusually rough. Louise's mother snapped back, warning him to mind his tone and demanding to know what business he had with her son. The man corrected her sharply. Maxion, he said, was the lost young master of the Caliad family. She scoffed at that, asking if he seriously expected her to hand the boy over just like that. Eamon replied that he would compensate her generously. She refused outright. Turning to Maxion, she told him plainly that the rough-looking man was trying to sell him for a large sum of money and that she had no intention of allowing such a thing. She urged him to go home and pressed a bag into his hands. At that, Amon flinched. He accused her of insanity, saying it was unthinkable to suggest such a thing to the young master. He pointed out her poor circumstances and insisted again that his offer was generous. She shot back that he was the insane one, spewing nonsense about someone else's son. Eamon frowned, stating coldly that Maxion did not resemble her in the slightest. She answered without hesitation that he simply took after his father. Declaring that she had heard enough from the strange man, she grabbed Maxion's hand and began dragging him away, listing off the mountain of things they still had to do at home. Maxion didn't resist, but something in his expression made her stop. She turned to him, sensing that something was wrong. He finally spoke, his voice quiet. The man had said his mother was alive, his father too. Behind them, Amon's lips curved into a slow grin. He said Maxion clearly needed time to gather his thoughts, and announced that he would return the next day at the same time. After that, he would send people to search for him. It would be wise, he warned, not to think about running away. Louise's mother said nothing as she led Maxion back toward home. Along the way, Maxion apologized under his breath. She told him it was fine. Then he noticed they were taking an unfamiliar route and asked why. She explained that they needed to shake off anyone tailing them before returning. When Maxion turned his head, he spotted men hidden among the bushes. She remarked calmly that 7 of them had followed, all clearly skilled. He really must come from a great family. They made it home safely. Inside the cabin, they explained everything to Louise. Louise stared at Maxion in disbelief, asking if he was really leaving for the north the next day. He confirmed it. The papers Amon carried proved his identity, and if what they said was true, he might be able to meet his mother again. Louise protested immediately, insisting that a fragile child like him couldn't possibly survive the harsh world outside. Maxion told her she couldn't measure the world by her own standards. Her mother intervened, saying she had taught Maxion enough to protect himself, at the very least, to escape if necessary. She admitted it was disappointing that he hadn't noticed the followers immediately, but he had still sensed their locations. If this was truly what he wanted, she could handle the rest. As they spoke, Maxion silently pieced things together. Caliad had already sent 7 people after him. The Viscount had treated everyone harshly except him. If Maxion stayed here, it was only a matter of time before Louise and her mother became targets. If things went badly, they might even have to abandon the cabin altogether. Questions he had never dared to voice surged up at once. Why had his mother never spoken about his father? Why hadn't she come looking for him after he left? And did she ever love him at all? He spoke firmly at last. He would go. His mother and father were together, and even though the word father still felt foreign, he wanted to meet him at least once. Louise asked if that meant he was leaving forever. He promised her he would come back, even if it took years. Louise's mother fell silent before finally nodding. As a parent, she said, it wouldn't be right to stop him from meeting his biological parents, but if he ever felt unhappy, he was to come back immediately. It wouldn't matter if they had to run away together for the rest of their lives. The words startled Maxion, making him flinch. She smiled gently and reminded him that family always came first. Their farewell came just as suddenly as their meeting had once been. The next morning arrived without time to prepare a proper gift. Louise's mother packed pocket money for him, along with a bottle of wine and a small amount of sleeping pills, clearly anticipating emergencies. Louise handed him an apple pie she had made, saying she knew it was his favorite and that she wouldn't be able to make it again for a while. He thanked her and promised to send letters from time to time. Saying goodbye, he turned and walked away as they waved after him. He arrived at the appointed meeting place, where Amon was waiting. The Viscount praised him, saying he truly was the young master and remarkably wise. Maxion pointed out that the people surrounding them were clearly part of his entourage, and that there were 3 more than the day before. Amon laughed softly, impressed. He admitted he had assumed the one who evaded them yesterday was the skilled woman. Maxion suggested they depart immediately so Aemon could claim his reward. The journey that followed was mostly peaceful. Viscount de Berg treated Maxion with respect, and the figures that had once followed like shadows gradually stepped forward to join them. All of them were northerners. Before he realized it, they had crossed the south and were heading north. Once they reached the forest, they would be in Lindemann territory. Caliad was close. That night, voices stirred while Maxion lay still, pretending to sleep. Someone mentioned the woman. Another clarified that they meant his mother. They spoke casually of the mistress who had died long ago in prison, agreeing that it would be better to claim she had fallen ill shortly before their arrival. Maxion's eyes flew open. Another voice muttered about the cruelty of it all, blaming Viscount de Berg for instigating the Count's madness. Someone else added that the Viscount had ordered the silver-haired woman to be found and killed, and that it would soon be known to the world that Caliad's successor had been raised in secret. That explained why 3 men had been left behind in perils, but those 3, it seemed, had suddenly disappeared. Maxion clenched the blanket around himself. A short while later, he rose quietly, a bottle in his hands, and stepped out of the tent. 2 soldiers stood nearby, the same ones who had been talking earlier. They stiffened when they saw him. He asked politely if they would soon be arriving at Caliad. He had brought wine to express his gratitude and wanted to pour them each a glass. One of them hesitated, but the other quickly laughed it off, insisting the young master must not have heard anything and telling him to act naturally. He cheerfully agreed, saying they were honored to serve him, and went to fetch the Viscount. Soon they were all drinking together, laughing as if nothing were wrong. Aemon reminisced fondly, saying it reminded him of old times. Then one of the soldiers collapsed. Aemon frowned, asking if he was already drunk. One by one, the others followed, crumpling to the ground. Realization struck too late. Aemon staggered, clutching his head as dizziness overtook him. Maxion called his name. Drawing his sword, Maxion stabbed him in the back. As Aemon screamed, Maxion told him everything he had heard, about his mother's death, his father's madness, and the order to kill the silver-haired woman. Aemon pleaded, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, accusing Maxion of being unfair. Maxion stabbed him again and again. He said that if Aemon spoke honestly, he would still go to Caliad. Aemon insisted he was telling the truth. Unsatisfied, Maxion continued until Aemon finally lashed out in fury, screaming that Maxion was born from something lowly and only capable of lowly deeds, despite Aemon having devoted his entire life to Caliad. That was the breaking point. Maxion finished him off. He killed every unconscious soldier as well. Only afterward did the weight of it hit him. He dropped the sword, drenched in sweat, struggling to breathe. After that, his memories blurred. He must have fled to nearby territory. Returning to the cabin was no longer possible. Eventually, he found himself collapsed in an alley in Lindemann territory, hoping the guilt and the lingering stench of blood would fade. His thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin and to Louise, but the discomfort never left. Footsteps approached. A man greeted him casually, remarking that it had been a while and that quite a mess had occurred. What finally forced Maxion to move, crumpled in the alley, was that voice. The man stated that a murder had occurred just a week after Maxion's arrival. If Maxion was responsible for the bodies in the woods, he would have to take him to the underground prison. Maxion recognized him at once. He looked like a noble from the south. Edward had found him. The man standing before Maxion wore plain clothes, nothing that marked him as a knight, yet something in his bearing, steady, composed, unafraid. did not belong to an ordinary passerby. Even without armor, he carried himself like someone accustomed to command. Perhaps he was from the guard unit after all. Maxion told him to go ahead and do it. The man regarded him evenly and asked whether he had no intention of defending himself or resisting. Maxion answered that he had no such intention. It was true that he had killed them. Instead of drawing a weapon or calling for soldiers, the man stepped closer and lowered himself to the ground beside him, sitting as though they were merely two men sharing the quiet of an alley. He said he had read Count Caliod's orders, found in Baron Berg's possession. According to those documents, the one before him was Maxion de Caliod, the Count's illegitimate child, born of a mistress. Was that correct? Maxion asked, whether the rumor had already spread. The man replied that he tended to be well informed about matters within the Empire. Then he introduced himself as Edward and addressed him by name. If he were to overlook his crime, he wondered what Maxion would do. Maxion studied him more closely and asked whether he was not a knight of the guards. Close enough, Edward said lightly. More importantly, he considered himself a good superior, one who recognized talent. Maxion offered no response. After a moment, Edward rose to his feet with a faint smile and told him to take care, adding that they would meet again soon. He left just as calmly as he had arrived, without reporting him, without attempting an arrest. After that encounter, Maxion threw himself into work. He registered with the Mercenary Guild to obtain identification and began taking on any job that came his way. The guild made things easier, tasks were plentiful, and danger was constant. Keeping busy dulled the edge of thought. But when he tried to sleep in a proper bed, guilt found him. Nightmares pressed against his mind the moment he closed his eyes. More often than not, he ended up sleeping on the streets instead, as if discomfort were the only rest he deserved. A month passed in that manner. During that time, Edward continued to appear before him without warning, as though their meeting in the alley had been the beginning of something deliberate. One day, when Edward approached him again, Maxion asked whether he was not taking him in today either. Edward replied that they were, in fact, in the middle of an interview. Maxion could not understand what held the man's interest. What could possibly compel someone of his standing to pursue a murderer with such persistence? Edward's gaze flicked to the pouch at Maxion's side. He remarked that the sleeping pills he had given him remained untouched. There had been no poison mixed in. Was he planning to sleep on the street again tonight? Maxion did not answer. Edward suggested there was a better place than Coldstone. If sleep would not come, they could watch the sunrise together. He knew a perfect spot. It might be worth going. Maxion, wary of the implication, stated flatly that he was heterosexual. Edward replied that he was as well. Maxion asked, without inflection, whether he had been a woman then. A brief silence followed before Edward observed that he truly seemed to have no prejudices at all. Maxion let the remark pass and asked where this spot was. At that, Edward smiled and turned to lead the way. They climbed to a secluded stretch of castle wall. No guards blocked their path. No servants lingered nearby. The vast stone expanse lay strangely empty. From there, the horizon opened wide, and the setting sun washed the sky in molten gold and deep crimson. They stood side by side, watching the light fade. Edward asked whether he liked it. Knights, he said, had once secretly brought their lovers here. It was forbidden now. Maxion glanced at him and asked whether he was truly suggesting that they become lovers. As he had already mentioned, he preferred women. Edward answered that it was something like that, then addressed him by his full name and told him to become his knight. Maxion pointed out that appointing a knight for an estate required the Duke's approval. There was no possibility that His Grace would approve of a murderer like him. Then the details began to align. Since arriving at the wall, they had not encountered a single person. No matter how capable a captain of the guards might be, controlling access to such a vast area with such ease would be impossible. And Edward had not asked him to serve the estate, but to be his knight. Edward turned toward him fully and revealed his name without hesitation. Archduke Edward Elliot von Lindemann. The weight of it settled over the quiet battlements. Maxion admitted that he did not understand why His Highness would take interest in someone like him. Edward answered plainly. Count Caliad would not abandon his only bloodline. He intended to have both Maxion and Caliad within his grasp. If Maxion wished to avoid falling under the Count's control and to live relatively peacefully, it would benefit him to join hands with him. At his side, the Count would not be able to drag him about as he pleased. Maxion could not deny the truth in that. He had no desire to serve under Count Caliad. More than anything, he wanted to uncover the precise circumstances surrounding his mother's death. He had recently heard that the young crown prince, once deposed due to a scandal involving the late empress, had become Duke Lindemann. As a duke, he would possess the authority to uncover hidden truths. He asked what would be required of him. Edward replied that becoming his ally would suffice. Setting aside the matter of bloodline, Maxion possessed exceptional talent. Even if he did not continue the Caliad line, he would lose nothing. Baron Berg had been a noble, and killing a noble warranted severe punishment. Yet Berg had been less than human, entangled in trafficking, abuse, and murder. He had received the punishment he deserved. Still, Edward made it clear he was not offering pardon through empty words. Maxion listened without expression. Murder was a grave crime. To atone, he would need to save 1,100 lives, including Edward's. The number struck him. He had anticipated something far harsher. Edward smiled faintly and repeated himself. He was to become his sword. Maxion lowered himself to one knee and bowed. He would obey His Highness's command. From that day forward, he pledged his loyalty to the prince. He set himself the goal of protecting Edward and the remaining 1,099 lives required for atonement. It was not difficult to find lives to save. He deliberately chose the most perilous assignments. With each life preserved, the weight on his chest eased. Gradually, the nightmares that had once driven him to the streets began to subside. 3 years later, when Edward reached adulthood, the emperor passed away. A new crown prince ascended the throne. Assassins appeared day and night, armed with magical tools that tore at Edward's mind as though searching for something buried within it. One night, in Edward's chamber, his sleeve was stained with blood. He spoke of what everyone had said, that he was the crown prince, the future emperor to be admired by the empire's people, that they must love him and serve him for their own sake. They questioned whether someone who had lost power and honor under suspicion of illegitimate blood still believed that day of glory remained, when he was already fading from memory. Maxion remained silent. Edward confessed that he did not wish to let go of the empire. He had sworn to someone that he would create a nation worthy of that person's gaze. To protect that vow, he would erase part of his memory. If it were sealed away, it could not be stolen. Maxion warned him that such magic carried severe side effects. It was too dangerous. Even so, Edward said he might simply lose his mind a little. That would mean Maxion would have to protect his body. When the time came, his memories would return. Until then, he would leave himself in Maxion's care. With that, he snapped his fingers and cast the spell. After the erasure, the emperor confirmed that there was nothing more to extract from him. The number of assassins and spies gradually diminished. Years later, Maxion stood awake by his window, looking out into the dark. Edward had been sent on a mission to perils, and though the intention to harm him had not changed, something had shifted after his return. By chance, Maxion had met Louise, and that meeting had carried him to where he now stood. It felt distant now, the days when he would blush merely at the sight of her. Yet she remained the most precious person in his life. What remained for him was simple: to become his lord's sword, to cleanse the world in which Edward would live. Elsewhere, Louise stood before Edward's door, hand lifted in hesitation before knocking. The handkerchief in her grasp was modest compared to the one he had lent her. It felt wrong to simply wash and return what she had used so carelessly. She had learned that sincerity mattered in such things. At the very least, she ought to thank him. The door opened abruptly, and Edward stood before her, immediately noticing who it was. He asked what had brought her there. Flustered, she held out the handkerchief. The one he had given her had been ruined, and she had been too embarrassed to wash and return it. Next time, she would give him something better. For now, this was all she had. Color rose to her cheeks as she spoke. Edward told her it was more than enough. In fact, he liked this one much more than his own. A faint blush touched his face as well, while he looked at her. She asked whether he had been unable to sleep again that night. He admitted that he had not. She observed that he must have been lonely, staying awake by himself. He conceded that perhaps he had been. Then she said that tonight, she would stay by his side until he fell asleep. Louise's offer left Edward momentarily stunned. Though he tried to maintain his usual gentle smile, a faint sheen of sweat betrayed him. She hurried to clarify that she had no bad intentions. It was simply that if he could not sleep, she could help. Before, he had stayed by her side through the night. This would be similar to that. After a brief pause, he stepped aside and told her he understood, inviting her in. She entered softly, and the moment she crossed the threshold, he shut the door with more force than necessary. The sound echoed faintly through the room. Almost at once, he asked whether she was certain this was appropriate. For the young lady of Serbenia to enter the bedroom of a man she was not even engaged to, was that truly wise? Louise assured him she had been careful not to be seen. She only hoped her aunt no longer thought of him as a rogue. He murmured that it was not an unnecessary concern. She blinked in confusion, asking what he meant. He told her he had changed his mind. He had begun wanting to make a move on her. The distance between them vanished as he stepped closer and leaned down slightly, his presence suddenly overwhelming. He asked whether she remembered what he had said earlier that day. She nodded, barely managing the word. His fingers slipped around her hand, and his voice dropped to a whisper near her ear. He was afraid she would leave him. The anxiety gnawed at him so intensely, it felt as though he might go mad. The confession caught her off guard. Was it because of the secret he was keeping from her? If not, did that mean she had become someone important to him? When she looked at him again, he was smiling, as if nothing heavy had just passed between them. He added lightly that it was the same even now. He was trembling, afraid that Miss Louise might abandon the poor patient in this cold, lonely room. She studied him and remarked that he did not seem that way at all. Then, as if remembering something, she mentioned that Maxian had woken up. Did that mean the Knights would be leaving tomorrow? Maxian's health seemed perfectly fine, almost as though he were under a state maintenance spell. Edward confirmed that it was the plan. If she was wondering whether they would remain here, tonight would likely be their last night. He asked whether she wished to stay. Louise lowered her gaze before answering. She had thought about it carefully. On an expedition, they never knew what might happen. If she remained in Serbenia, she was certain she could live a comfortable life. He waited without interrupting, but she continued, saying she enjoyed the journey she had taken with him and Maxian. She wanted to know the things the two of them were hiding. She would not leave until she discovered the truth. She smiled as she said it. He returned the smile, though something in it was softer now, more vulnerable. He admitted he was relieved. There were many reasons she might leave him, and he had been anxious because he could not find a reason strong enough to keep her by his side. Sometimes he thought it would be fine if she used him, so long as she did not abandon him. His fingers tugged lightly at the sleeve of her dress as he asked her to stay by his side tonight. He would even beg if necessary. She told him she did not mind being there. Then, carefully, he asked whether, like last time, she would keep him company. They had talked about all sorts of things and fallen asleep together. Would that be too difficult? She agreed, but insisted he sleep in the bed. He protested that he could not allow her to sit on the floor. She suggested placing a chair beside the bed instead. He shook his head slightly and said that if he felt her watching him, he might not be able to sleep. She considered that. If his insomnia was psychological, perhaps her gaze would only burden him further. Without warning, he began removing his shirt. He explained that, at the very least, he would lay something down for her. It was unfortunate, but since he was unfamiliar with the mansion, he did not know where the blankets were. When he handed the shirt to her, she stared at him in shock. He asked whether his gown would suffice for her, and if she needed more. She cut him off in flustered haste, insisting it was fine, more than enough. Her face burned as she turned away from him. He added mildly that he had been thinking of bringing towels from the bathroom. After that, he slipped into the bed. Louise settled on the floor beside it, her back turned to him, the borrowed shirt folded over her lap. She asked whether he had closed his eyes. He said he had. Since she had shared her own story in the annex, she suggested that he tell her something about himself tonight. Last time, he had fallen asleep while talking. He replied that he had been so busy during his childhood that when he thought about the past, there was not much that came to mind. It felt as though there were holes in his memories, leaving them faint and fragmented. But if there was something he did remember, it was his curiosity about life beyond the royal palace. As he spoke, he turned toward her and began absently twirling a strand of her hair around his fingers. She found herself unable to respond. He called her name softly. There was no answer. He pushed himself up slightly and realized she had already fallen asleep. A quiet sigh escaped him. Was she not being too defenseless, falling asleep in a strange man's bedroom? He would appreciate it if she did not take such things so lightly. Carefully, he lifted her from the floor and laid her on the bed, pulling the covers over her. As he began to withdraw, her hand shot out and caught his, pulling him closer. The sudden movement brought him leaning over her, his face hovering dangerously near her lips. For a moment, temptation surged. The distance between them was nothing. Then he recoiled slightly, his hand trembling. They were far too close. He should quietly slip away. Was it possible to leave without waking her? Her fingers tightened around his hand, stubborn even in sleep. There was no escape. With resignation, he lay down beside her, watching her peaceful expression in the dim light. This was bad. Even asleep, she looked unbearably cute. How was he supposed to pull himself away from her? Morning came gently. Louise stirred and opened her eyes to warmth, soft arms wrapped around her. For a fleeting second, she only registered comfort. Then awareness struck. Arms. She realized whose they were and flushed deeply. A quiet voice near her ear remarked that this was how things had ended up. She jolted upright and scrambled to the opposite side of the bed. Edward also sat up, creating distance between them. He asked whether she had slept well. Thanks to her, he said. It seemed he had slept well too. Her face turned scarlet as she demanded how he could do something like this. He protested that it was unfair. She had grabbed him first and refused to let go. She stared at him in disbelief. She had? He apologized if he had startled her. He had tried to lay her down and move to the sofa, but she would not release his arm. He had attempted to pull away, yet somehow had fallen asleep. The rest of it was not entirely true. Overwhelmed, she rushed toward the door, cheeks burning. She exclaimed that she did not know what she had done, apologizing repeatedly. She was going to her morning training and would see him later. He told her it was a shame to send her off like this, but he could not really get up at the moment. She fled, closing the door behind her. Left alone, he remained seated for a moment before breaking into a wide grin. He fell back against the pillow, pressing his face into it, blushing as he inhaled the faint, lingering scent. A few hours later, preparations were complete, and the knights set out once more. As a token of appreciation, Aunt Lorraine had new knight uniforms made for everyone. Outside the manor, Edward thanked her sincerely for everything. She replied that they were the ones who should be grateful for resolving the territory's grave issues. She handed him a document from Castle, the head of the family. The Silver Eagle Knights would receive the highest honors in all territories connected to Serbenia, free of cost. She apologized for not visiting him sooner, addressing him formally. He asked her not to dwell too much on the past. She relayed Castle's words, that to heal the decaying empire, His Highness was needed. She would see him in the capital next time. He thanked her for her kindness, though he added that he would need to consider whether to share this information with Louise. She inclined her head in understanding. Nearby, Louise and Maction stood watching the exchange. Louise's face was still faintly flushed, and Maction noticed. He called her name. She responded, trying to sound composed. He observed that she looked strange, and asked whether something had happened last night. Nothing had happened, she blurted out far too loudly. The sudden outburst drew Edward and Aunt Lorraine's attention at once. Realizing her mistake, she clapped a hand over her mouth in embarrassment. She quickly claimed she had remembered something she had left behind and would return shortly. Without waiting for a reply, she hurried away. Maxion and Aunt Lorraine watched her go, both puzzled by her behavior. Edward, meanwhile, stood there with a broad grin and a faint blush. When Maxion and Aunt Lorraine noticed his expression, understanding dawned between them. Something had definitely happened. Rayard staggered into his room, one hand pressed against his forehead as a dull headache throbbed behind his eyes. The night of drinking had left him unsteady and irritable. They had spent hours drinking together, yet the only thing he had managed to learn was the Crown Prince's least favorite spice, cinnamon. The thought alone made him scoff bitterly. Princess Diana clearly liked him. That much had been obvious. Yet every time the Crown Prince was mentioned, she had smoothly changed the subject, deliberately steering the conversation away. She was avoiding the topic on purpose, and Rayard knew it. As he walked past a vase filled with red roses, he paused and turned his head to stare at them. The color reminded people of the Crown Prince's eyes, or so they said. The thought sparked immediate anger. In a sudden outburst, he grabbed the vase and slammed it violently against the ground. Water splashed across the floor as the roses scattered and crumpled beneath the shards. A fake daring to act as though he were real. The Crown Prince? The idea was laughable. Even if he carried royal blood, it was tainted by that filthy mistress. Water soaked Rayard's clothes as he stood there staring down at the shattered vase and ruined flowers. Louise had not returned since the final banquet, remaining away until the Crown Prince's departure. She had probably gone back to the cabin in perils. If she was there, it was only a matter of time before she began missing him again. Without a doubt, she would. The scene shifted to a quiet stretch of grass where Maxion sat with Louise, calmly explaining their travel plans. They would be stopping at 3 locations in total, he reminded her. If everything went according to schedule, they would reach the first destination in about a week. Once they arrived, she would need to follow instructions without question. No matter how strong she was, that part was non-negotiable. Louise agreed without hesitation. Maxion continued by explaining that their final destination was a village located near the cabin. Louise immediately reacted with recognition, remembering the festival they had once attended there as children. Maxion confirmed that she remembered correctly. As he spoke, a quiet thought crossed his mind. By the time they reached their final destination, the new year would likely have arrived. Louise would turn 25 next year, the same age when the Rock of Faith was meant to be checked. If that were the case, Louise interrupted his thoughts with a request. Once their task was finished, could she visit the cabin? The question caught him slightly off guard, and he asked why. She explained that her mother had once told her to check beneath the rock near the cabin when she turned 25. Maxion admitted that he had always been curious about that himself. Before he had left the cabin years ago, he had been told something similar, that she must not leave the forest until reaching a certain age. Louise realized the same warning had been given to him as well. In her case, she had already left the forest long before that age, yet nothing bad had happened, so she assumed it would be fine. Maxion quietly disagreed in his thoughts. The situation did not feel so simple. Still, he concluded that Edward would probably allow her to leave briefly when the time came. They could go together and check the rock. Louise blinked in surprise at the suggestion, asking if he truly intended to accompany her. He confirmed that he would. Before the conversation could continue, a knight suddenly shouted across the field, calling for the deputy commander. His Highness was glaring at them. Maxion flinched instinctively, while Louise's cheeks flushed slightly. With a resigned sigh, Maxion suggested they head over. Louise quickly looked away and told him to go ahead without her. Maxion hesitated, pointing out that she had been acting strangely since morning. Before she could answer, the knight shouted again that His Highness was heading toward them. Louise reacted nervously, insisting she had not been acting strange at all. At that exact moment, Edward approached from behind without her noticing. Calmly stepping into the conversation, he remarked that Maxion had probably only been trying to point something out. Maxion confirmed this. Edward admitted that for a moment he had thought the two of them might be avoiding him. Maction replied bluntly that Louise seemed to want to. Louise immediately protested, asking when she had ever said such a thing and telling Maction not to leave. Maction simply refused and walked away with a casual farewell, leaving her alone with Edward. Edward then lowered himself onto the grass beside her. The moment he called her name, Louise flinched, her face already warm with embarrassment. He asked her to look at him for a moment and wondered if he was making her uncomfortable. She hurried to deny it, though she admitted she still could not forget what had happened that morning. Edward apologized. Even if it had been unintentional, holding her like that had been a mistake. If he had known she would dislike it so much, he would have forced himself to wake up. Louise immediately protested, insisting she had not disliked it at all. The words escaped before she could stop them, and she quickly covered her mouth in embarrassment. Edward calmly pointed out that she had just said she did not dislike it. Flustered, she tried to clarify that she had only meant she felt embarrassed, not that she hated it. Edward suggested that perhaps they should keep doing it until she became used to it. When he had woken up that morning holding her, he had liked it very much. In fact, if she wished for it, he could do even more. The implication stunned her. Her thoughts stumbled over the meaning of those words. More? Edward quickly clarified that he was not saying such things lightly. Recently, he had begun wondering what their relationship might be like if it were not based on a contract or a lie. The thought came to him often. Louise struggled to process what he meant. Edward gently asked that, when she had the time, she think about it at least once, what it might be like if they became a real couple. His warm smile caused her heart to flutter, leaving her blushing even more deeply. Time passed, and later that day, the group approached their first destination as the sun began to set. Louise rode quietly, her mind tangled with Edward's words. They had not changed much in their relationship so far, yet something felt different. The way he openly cared for her stood out clearly in her memories. Her thoughts felt chaotic, but strangely, she found herself wondering whether she should feel relieved that he was not focusing only on her. Night soon fell, and the group gathered around a bonfire. Edward approached Louise and handed her a marshmallow roasted over the flames. She thanked him and took the stick, tasting it as he watched with a gentle smile. When she admitted that it was good, he seemed pleased and offered to make a few more. Louise glanced at him again, her cheeks warming as she observed him. His appearance naturally drew everyone's attention. His voice was sweet, his demeanor both solemn and kind. Few women could remain unaffected by someone like him. Considering that, perhaps it was not strange for her to feel the way she did. Not far away, several knights were watching the two of them with amused expressions. One of them sighed dramatically about the joys of youth, complaining that he could not tell whether this expedition had turned into a love story. The two of them had known each other for quite some time already, so why did things suddenly feel so affectionate? A black-haired knight calmly explained that it was because they had not been dating before. Robin reacted with exaggerated shock, loudly demanding confirmation. Another knight with white hair added that he doubted things would progress further. If this had happened back when His Highness had been reckless and unpredictable, perhaps it might have. But now that he had become more rational, he was likely already thinking about what would happen after the mission ended. Robin trembled in disbelief, realizing he had been the only one completely unaware of this situation. The following day, the group continued their journey on horseback. They expected to reach a village soon, but something felt off. One of the knights laughed awkwardly, remarking that there should definitely have been a village nearby by now. Yet there was not a single house or building in sight. At this rate, it looked like they would be camping out again that night. Perhaps they had taken the wrong path. Louise agreed that the situation was strange. Edward suddenly called Maction's name and asked if he could see something straight ahead. From a distance, it looked like a giant mirror. Maction confirmed that he could see it. Edward suggested they move closer. The group dismounted and approached carefully. Maction examined the structure and noted that the entire front of the building was made of mirrors. He wondered when such a thing had been constructed. A structure like this would surely have caused rumors if it had existed before. Edward decided they should scout the area. Hendrik and Avon were instructed to follow him, while the rest remained behind. As the others waited, a green-haired knight suddenly noticed another knight named Ben staring intently at a specific section of the mirrored building. Ben's eyes had turned a strange yellow color. The knight called out to him, telling him to stop fooling around and come back. Ben did not respond. Instead, he slowly walked toward a large crack in the mirrored wall. The knight shouted again, calling his name and demanding that he stop. But Ben continued forward, as if he could not hear anything. Louise flinched when she heard the shouting and turned around. Several knights rushed toward Ben, calling his name in alarm, but none of them managed to reach him in time. Ben stepped through the crack in the mirror and entered the building. The moment he passed through, the mirrors began to shift and repair themselves, sealing the opening as if it had never existed. Louise watched the scene unfold with growing shock and worry as the building silently closed behind him. Louise and Edward stood with the black-haired knight, discussing the strange incident that had just occurred. The knight explained that the situation appeared to be the work of the same group responsible for the events in Serbenia, judging by the identical methods that had been used. Unfortunately, it seemed they had arrived too late this time. The entire village had most likely already been swallowed by black magic, and if another sacrifice were added now, the phenomenon would only grow larger and more powerful. Louise hesitantly wondered whether the mirrored structure they had discovered could be connected to this. The knight confirmed that it was. In fact, that building had been their first destination all along. Normally, this type of black magic required about a month to completely absorb a living person. Anyone who had already been trapped inside before that point would likely be. The sentence trailed off, but the implication hung heavily in the air. The mood among the group darkened instantly as the grim reality of the situation settled over them. Edward shifted his focus to the practical side of the problem. Physical attacks clearly were not effective against the structure, so he asked how long the state-maintaining magic applied to their uniforms would last. The knight estimated that the enchantment should hold for roughly a week. However, he admitted he was uncertain whether Ben would be able to locate what they called the real thing. Edward questioned what that meant. The knight explained that magic based on illusions typically collapsed once the true object hidden within the illusion's range was found. That meant the mirrored building was likely filled with countless fakes designed to mislead anyone searching inside. After hearing this, Edward immediately began organizing a plan. 3 individuals who were particularly skilled at searching would be selected and deployed as a team to investigate. Meanwhile, the external team would remain outside and restrain anyone who attempted to approach the building. The knights responded in unison, accepting the orders without hesitation. Night eventually fell, and the group set up their camp nearby. Most of the knights slept inside their tents, exhausted from the day's events. Outside, the bonfire burned quietly, while Edward remained awake, sitting alone and thinking deeply about the situation with an unreadable expression. Louise noticed him sitting there by himself and slowly approached. She asked whether he often stayed up through the night like this. Edward flinched slightly at the sudden question, before calmly replying that it did not happen often enough for her to worry about. His answer only confirmed to Louise that he did it frequently. She admitted that whenever she could not sleep, she sometimes came outside just like this to pass the time. If he continued to stay up on nights like this, she would keep him company. Edward simply agreed. For a moment, he stared at her in silence before speaking again. Recently, whenever he looked at her, he felt as though he was about to remember something. He wondered if perhaps they had met somewhere long ago. Louise responded that they had seen each other often during the banquets. Edward replied that he remembered all of those occasions clearly. The response confused her slightly. She pointed out that they had encountered each other more often than he might realize. She had always assumed he only noticed because she happened to be standing beside someone particularly striking. Edward dismissed that assumption immediately. He had never been interested in the people beside him. What had captured his attention instead was her hair. It had reminded him of a field of pure white snow glowing beneath the moonlight, something so beautiful that he had found himself unable to look away. The unexpected confession left Louise momentarily speechless. her cheeks turning red as warmth spread across her face. To steady herself, she quietly sat down beside the bonfire before speaking again. She remarked that Edward did not seem like the type of person who would ever use vulgar or harsh words. Edward sat beside her as well, casually adjusting the firewood to keep the flames alive. He replied that she should not judge people solely by appearances. Louise murmured that perhaps he was right. She studied his face carefully while thinking to herself. Because she had always seen him behave so politely and properly, it was difficult for her to imagine him saying anything cruel or unpleasant. Occasionally, there was a mysterious look in his eyes, but even so, she concluded that there was at least one thing she felt certain about. Edward was a good person. Even if he turned out to be slightly worse than she imagined, she would still be fine with that. Days passed. On the 6th day, Louise found herself tying 2 knights to a nearby tree. As she worked, she quietly noted the passage of time. 6 days had already gone by. During that entire period, no one who had entered the building, including the search team, had returned. Meanwhile, the number of people who had become mesmerized by the mirrors and attempted to approach the building had steadily increased, forcing the others to restrain them like this. The black-haired knight approached Edward and reported that 2 more night watchmen had been consumed by the building the previous night. Edward remained silent, but inside his mind, he calculated the situation grimly. By tomorrow, the magic stones attached to their uniforms would lose their protective effect. Those who had entered the building on the first day would soon be approaching the point of death. With that realization, Edward reached a decision. He announced that he would go inside himself. The white-haired knight immediately objected, insisting that such a thing was impossible. They were there to protect him, after all. How could the crown prince enter the building personally? Edward calmly explained that if no one went in, the people trapped inside would eventually be completely consumed by black magic. Once that happened, the magic would grow stronger and expand even further. Requesting support from the imperial palace was not an option either. Louise suddenly spoke up, offering to accompany him if the task simply required searching for something inside. Edward rejected the idea immediately. Maxion did the same without hesitation. Confused, Louise asked why. Edward explained that this type of magic was not something that could be overcome by the strongest swordsman alone. If the structure prevented outside influence from affecting it, then the same restriction likely applied within. His goal would simply be to locate those trapped inside and return within 10 days. He believed that he alone could endure inside the building for that long. Maxion then volunteered to go in first instead. Edward refused him as well, reminding him that he had already struggled with black magic recently. Maxion's role was to remain outside and lead the knights. In the meantime, he must ensure that no one attempted to escape from the building. Louise clenched her fists tightly before asking for one condition. If Edward did not return within a week, she wanted permission to enter the building herself and search for him. Edward responded with a faint smile, remarking that her conditions sounded more like a frightening threat. Louise ignored the remark and demanded a promise. Edward replied that he would do his best, but if he failed to come out within a week, she should follow Maxion and Avon's orders instead. Her entering the building would not serve as a threat. She called his name quietly. Maxion then stepped forward and asked Louise to promise that she would obey their orders. The request left her looking visibly saddened, but after a moment, she finally nodded in reluctant agreement. Edward then added one final instruction. If 10 days passed and he still had not emerged from the building, it would mean the situation was truly dangerous. At that point, he wanted Louise to leave the area entirely. The statement shocked her. She protested immediately, but Edward cut her off. This was not a request. As the person in charge of the mission, he was giving her a direct order. His expression remained serious and unwavering as he said it. Without another word, Edward approached the crack in the mirrored building and stepped through it. The moment he passed inside, the mirrors shifted and sealed the opening behind him. Louise stood there watching it happen, unable to shake the deep worry forming in her chest. Her mind drifted back to a conversation she had shared with Edward before he entered the building. At that time, He had told her that he had not joined this expedition to put her in danger. No matter how dangerous the situation became, he had come because he believed he could protect her. Louise had argued that she was strong enough to protect herself, but Edward had countered her argument by reminding her that Maxion felt the same way about protecting others. There were forms of magic that could not be stopped by physical strength or skill alone. Remembering those words now left her standing there silently, staring down at the ground. Several days passed. Suddenly, the knights shouted in excitement. Ben had come out. One by one, the members who had entered the building began to emerge from the mirrored structure. Every single one of them returned safely. Every single one, except Edward. The knights questioned them anxiously, asking whether they had seen His Highness inside. Louise rushed toward Ben the moment she spotted him, desperate for answers. Ben lowered his head apologetically, admitting that he had not seen the Crown Prince anywhere inside. The news struck Louise like a blow, leaving her unable to believe what she had just heard. Time passed again. More than 10 days had now gone by since Edward entered the mirrored building. Inside one of the tents, Maxion approached Louise quietly. He told her that the 10 days had passed and reminded her of the promise she had made. As agreed, she needed to leave now. Louise sat on the bed in silence, looking exhausted and sorrowful. She was still at the campsite, waiting for Edward to return, despite the promise she had made. She wore one of Edward's shirts, clutching it unconsciously as she continued to wait, refusing to leave the place where he had disappeared. Maxion stood beside the white horse, holding Louise's luggage as she prepared to leave the forest, his voice steady as he told her he would come see her once everything was resolved. She answered immediately that she did not believe him. When he insisted he was only saying it because he did not want her to get hurt, she turned sharply, eyes fixed on him, and told him it was not for her sake at all. If she lost everyone and was left alone again, there would be no happiness in that, and if either he or Edward were hurt while she watched, then she would only be left waiting for that loneliness to return. She asked why he always forced her into the same choice. Maxion could only apologize, but she brushed it aside, saying she was tired of waiting without knowing when anything would end. She mounted her horse, her thoughts drifting back to perils, to promises of someday, and the slow, suffocating uncertainty that followed. She knew that feeling too well and refused to endure it again. It was over. Then, in a sudden motion, she pulled the reins, the horse rearing before turning sharply. Maxion called out in alarm, but she was already moving. From now on, she would go find him herself. She galloped straight toward the mirrored building, and as she approached, the structure opened, as if welcoming her inside. Deep within the maze, Edward stood alone, blood at the edge of his lips, time slipping beyond his grasp. He wondered how much had passed, recalling faintly that when he first entered, he had been surrounded entirely by mirrors reflecting countless forms. He had understood quickly that these reflections were false and that the real one had to be hidden among them. Determined to act efficiently, he had traced the locations of his scattered companions and continued searching while supplying mana to sustain them. It had not taken long to find what he believed to be the real one. Yet the moment he reached that conclusion, something struck him. Pain surged through him, sharp enough to draw blood. Mana clashed violently within his body, wrong in a way that went beyond simple dark magic. He had clutched his chest, his hand trembling as weakness crept in, but he ignored it. First, he had to send the others out. As he forced his mana outward, guiding his team toward escape, the pain worsened. Then footsteps approached, and a man with red eyes appeared before him, an identical reflection, yet not a reflection at all. It spoke calmly, telling him it would hurt. Edward recognized it immediately as another version of himself, one born from the magic he had once cast. This other self explained that it was not the dark magic outside that bound the maze, but Edward's own sealed power. He had hidden it to keep it from the Emperor, locking away not only that power, but fragments of his memories. That incompleteness was why the magic could not be undone. Edward realized then that his own fractured state was the true obstacle. The other self continued, explaining that even with the current scale of magic, it would not unravel easily, especially with Edward's injuries worsening. It would take time. days for his unconscious self to recover, and longer still before he could properly wield magic again. Edward understood the implication immediately. Even knowing the answer, he could not act on it. This place had become the perfect prison for him. Worse still, the unconscious version of himself was already being consumed by the black magic outside. It would not destroy him completely, but it would leave lingering damage. Edward acknowledged the situation with quiet resignation. Since he could not resolve it himself, the only option was to wait for someone else to arrive and discover the answer. But the moment he tried to speak it aloud, the backlash would injure him again. He wondered then if Maxion had sent someone in after him. Looking up, he froze. Louise stood before him. He demanded to know why she was there. She, meanwhile, seemed disoriented, suspended for a moment as though the ground itself had vanished. Her horse was gone. She fell, landing hard, wincing in pain as she called out for Blue. When she lifted her gaze, she was met not with Edward, but with another version of herself. The mirrors around her no longer reflected simple images. Each one showed something different, something vivid, like fragments of memory. As she moved, the reflections shifted, becoming scenes rather than surfaces. She realized they were not mirrors in the ordinary sense at all. One image made her freeze, her face flushing as she recognized it. A moment between herself and Edward, intimate and unmistakable, seen now from a third-person perspective. The embarrassment struck her harder than before, and she quickly turned away, deciding to go in another direction. But when she opened her eyes again, she found herself facing a younger version of herself. It did not feel like a reflection. It felt real. She reached out instinctively, intending to pat the child on the head, but before her hand could make contact, the younger version turned and ran. Louise chased after her, turning the corner, only to find nothing. An empty corridor stretched before her, silent and still. She realized then that it had not been the real one they were meant to find. As she looked up again, another mirror revealed a familiar forest from her past, one she had visited every day years ago. The scent of grass seemed almost tangible, as though she could step back into that time if she reached out. Beside it lay another vision, a dying forest, stark and desolate, abandoned without its owner. She stood there, caught in the weight of memory, unaware that Edward had approached from behind, watching her as she stared into the past. Louise stood frozen before the mirror, her gaze fixed as the memory unfolded in full. Her mother's voice echoed gently, telling her to avoid going into the forest as much as possible. Even now, Louise understood the weight behind those words. That vague condition had never been meaningless. It had been a quiet acknowledgement that something inevitable was waiting for her there, something that would one day draw her in no matter how much she resisted. In the memory, her younger self stood before a deer that seemed to be trying to intimidate her, yet she simply greeted it, her cheeks faintly flushed. There had been no fear in her then, only a strange sense of familiarity, as though the forest itself had already claimed her. The scene shifted, and she saw herself tending to a wounded rabbit, carefully wrapping its injured leg. When she finished, she smiled softly, telling it not to get hurt again. The rabbit leaped into her arms as if understanding, clinging to her with affection. Back then, most of the animals had been kind to her, welcoming her presence. Only the larger ones had treated her as something unfamiliar. She remembered those early mornings, walking alone through the dark forest at dawn. When the light began to break, she would climb to the hilltop and look out, quietly reflecting on her own heart. There had always been a longing there, a pull toward something brighter. As she watched the distant glow, she admired it, wishing the Forest of Perils could shine the same way. But it never did. It remained dim, heavy, unreachable. That distance had filled her with a quiet loneliness she could never quite explain. Then came the day everything changed, the first time she stepped outside the forest. The winter festival in Kavan unfolded before her, vibrant and overwhelming. It had been a celebration of her and Maxion's 10th birthday, and everything about it had felt unreal. Vendors called out to her, asking if she wanted to glimpse her future or try their sweets, their voices blending into a lively hum. She had been completely captivated, her eyes wide as she took it all in, overwhelmed by the sheer wonder of things she had never seen before. Her mother's voice cut through the noise, reminding her and Maxion to stay close, to gather at the central square if they got lost, to remain alert. They had both answered obediently, though her attention quickly drifted again. She wandered until she stopped before a puppeteer, watching as he told the story of two dragons, one white, Ron of the North, and the other black, defeated by the dragon slayer Lencia. The tale held her attention for only a moment before something else caught it entirely. A strange sensation stirred within her. She turned instinctively, drawn toward it, and saw three hooded figures walking away. One of them paused and looked back. Beneath the hood was a boy, young, striking, impossibly beautiful. Even then, the impression lingered. The faint scent of roses seemed to surround him, vivid and out of place in the heart of winter. The memory shifted again. An alleyway, dim and tense. The same boy stood there, a blade pressed to his throat by a thief. The threat was immediate, the danger unmistakable, yet his voice remained calm as he told the man to let go. The thief only tightened his grip, warning him not to scream. The boy replied coolly that if anything, it would be the thieves who would die. They mocked him, noting his refined speech, guessing at his noble origins, but dismissing it as irrelevant. Instead, they spoke of selling him, reducing him to something less than human. Before they could act, Louise moved. Her younger self struck without hesitation, kicking the first thief hard enough to send him collapsing to the ground. She landed lightly, already moving toward the second. He barely had time to react before she warned him to let the boy go. Instead, he grabbed her hood, attempting to dismiss her as nothing more than a child. She shed the robe in one motion, drawing her weapon. She had been taught not to harm people outside the forest, so she made her choice clear. She would deal with him using the scabbard alone. The fight ended as quickly as it began. The second thief fell, unconscious, leaving only silence behind. She sheathed her weapon and turned to the boy, checking if he was hurt. He assured her he was fine, thanking her for saving him. She studied him curiously, asking if he wore perfume. When he said he did not, she remarked on the pleasant scent of roses surrounding him. When he asked if she liked roses, she answered without hesitation that she did, smiling brightly. In response, he promised that the next time they met, he would bring her roses as thanks. She accepted eagerly, asking that they be as red as his eyes. He agreed, committing it to memory. He suggested they leave the alley together, offering his hand. She hesitated only briefly before taking it. When he gave his name, Elliot, she nearly offered hers in return, catching herself at the last moment as her mother's warning resurfaced in her mind. She adjusted quickly, telling him to simply call her Lo. They walked side by side toward the square, their hands still joined, exchanging small talk along the way. For her, the experience was entirely new, speaking with someone outside her small world, someone who was not Maxion. The excitement lingered with every step. As they neared the center, she spoke openly, confessing how wonderful and beautiful the world seemed, far beyond anything she had imagined from books. She even questioned her mother's harsh words about the emperor, wondering how someone who created such a place could be bad. To her, it all felt too bright, too full of life. He asked why she thought so. She answered simply that a world like this could not exist without someone good behind it, and that she hoped it would remain just as beautiful the next time she returned. He promised quietly that it would. Then he asked her something more serious, if she would still save someone else the same way she had saved him. She answered without hesitation that she would. Even when he pointed out that risking oneself for others was not easy, she only questioned whether a reason was needed at all. To her, it had not been dangerous. She was strong. Her confidence surprised him, but he accepted it with a small smile. Their attention shifted upward as a lantern drifted into the sky. He explained the tradition, that wishes written and released with it would come true. She expressed regret that she could not take part, so he told her she could simply speak her wish instead. After a brief pause, she admitted what she wanted, to meet him again. It had been a long time since she had made a new friend. He assured her that such a wish would likely come true. Encouraged, she continued, revealing her desire to one day visit the capital despite her parents' warnings. She imagined it as a place overflowing with light, somewhere the entire world would shine brilliantly. Even the dark and desolate outskirts of perils, she believed, would glow if she saw it. She watched the lanterns rise, her face lit with quiet hope, imagining a world that sparkled like the sun. Beside her, Elliot held her hand and watched her instead, a faint smile forming as he took in the light reflected in her eyes. The memory continued to unfold, and within it, the young girl turned toward the boy beside her, asking what his wish might be. He answered without hesitation, expressing a quiet hope that the Empire would one day become a place that lived up to her expectations, and that he would find her again to repay the kindness she had shown him. From his pocket, he produced a small coin and placed it in her hand, telling her to keep it so that when the time came, he would be able to find her and deliver that promise. He urged her to stay safe on her way back. What followed that gentle exchange was not a continuation of light, but a return to darkness. The path ahead led back into the forest, into separation from those she loved, and into a life that gradually lost its meaning. By the time her mother was gone, and the emptiness had settled in completely, Riard had appeared like a lifeline, and she had taken his hand without realizing that what awaited her was not salvation, but another kind of cage. Back in the present, Louise clenched her fists, the realization weighing heavily on her. At that time, Riard had seemed like the only path forward, a way out, but now she understood the truth of it. She struck her own cheeks lightly, grounding herself, refusing to fall back into that same helplessness. She could not leave Edward behind. Now that she had escaped that prison, she had found people she wanted to walk beside, not chase after or wait for. That alone was enough to keep her moving. A voice reached her from behind, lightly chiding her that if she kept hitting herself, she would need treatment before long. She flinched at the sound. Edward had approached without her noticing, his hand closing gently around hers as she turned to face him. He spoke calmly, reminding her to make her decisions carefully in the absence of someone like Robin. She stared at him, uncertain, asking if it was truly him. He confirmed it was, though she immediately pointed out that the mirror did not reflect him at her side. He explained that each person's reflection was tied to their own memories and perceptions, and that to him, the scene appeared the same. She accepted this explanation and moved on, asking why, if everyone else had escaped, he alone remained trapped. He admitted that he had already found the answer, but circumstances had prevented him from breaking the spell. When she urged him to tell her so she could try, he agreed, but insisted there was something else they needed to address first. Her expression shifted, and she instinctively avoided his gaze. She recalled his earlier warning, that if he failed to return within 10 days, it meant the danger was real, and she should leave. Now, standing here, she could not meet that expectation. She claimed not to understand what he meant, but he could see through it. He asked plainly how she had managed to deceive Maxian and enter the building. She admitted it without hesitation, explaining that she had pretended to leave before turning back and rushing in. He questioned what she would do if she were hurt, but she dismissed the concern, explaining that she had taken precautions and, more importantly, that she had not come here to be protected. She was here because she wanted to protect everyone involved. Next time, she added, he should not leave her behind. Something about her words unsettled him. The familiarity of it, the way it stirred something buried deep within him, felt dangerous in a way he could not fully grasp. Still, he accepted it outwardly, saying that if she would not listen, there was nothing more he could do now that she was already inside. She responded with a hint of irritation, pointing out that he was just as reckless, reminding him how worried everyone had been. He brushed it aside, saying he was not someone who would die easily, and that losing everyone mattered far more than losing everything. That answer struck her deeply, frustration rising as she challenged him. Everyone was risking themselves to protect him, yet he spoke as if his own life carried little weight. He answered simply that it was his duty. His life had been decided for him since childhood, filled with obligations and people he was bound to protect. Even now, there were things he had to do that he could not explain. His own feelings on the matter were irrelevant. She argued that things were different now, that he was no longer that child, that he had the right to live his own life. He answered that fulfilling those remaining duties was the life he had chosen. When she asked why, he admitted that even he could not clearly remember. Whenever he tried to think about it, his mind grew hazy. The answer, he suspected, lay somewhere within the memories he had lost. That revelation startled her. He confirmed it quietly. He had indeed lost memories, and that loss was the very reason he could not escape this place. In his current state, incomplete and fractured, he was no different from the illusions surrounding them. That realization sparked something in her. If he was no different from the reflections, then perhaps the same logic applied to her. She turned toward one of the mirrors, pointing at the version of herself within it, and questioned whether that was the real her. At that moment, the mirror cracked. He confirmed her suspicion. The solution, despite its complexity, was simple. The collapse of everything around them was nothing more than an illusion, and she would not be harmed by it. The cracks spread rapidly, splintering across every surface. As the structure began to break apart, she noticed something wrong with him. His cheek had begun to fracture like glass. Alarmed, she reached out, touching his face, feeling the unnatural texture beneath her fingers. He explained quickly that the dark magic had taken its toll over the past few days, and that he did not have much time to explain. She should not be alarmed if his condition seemed strange for a while. Before she could respond, he pulled her into an embrace. Around them, the mirrored world shattered. When the cracking finally stopped, she opened her eyes. Something felt off immediately. She looked up at him and froze. He collapsed. She caught him before he could hit the ground, calling out his name, but he had already lost consciousness. The others rushed in, their voices overlapping as they called out to both of them. Hendrik stepped forward, confused at Edward's state. Louise explained what little she knew, that he had warned her of possible side effects after breaking the spell. Hendrik concluded that he had simply overexerted himself, relieved that the magic had finally been undone. He moved to carry him, but before he could, Edward stirred. He muttered that it was noisy. Louise blinked in surprise at how quickly he had regained consciousness and asked if he was all right. When he looked at her, something was different. His gaze was sharp, unfamiliar, almost dangerous. He studied her as if seeing her for the first time, then reached out suddenly, pulling her closer by the waist. The abrupt movement caught her completely off guard. He questioned whether he had lost his mind and brought a woman into his room, or if she had come here to kill him. The tension thickened instantly. Hendrik stepped in, explaining that he was likely still disoriented, that she was not an enemy but someone close to him, his lover. The word lingered in the air. Edward repeated it, then glanced between Louise and Hendrik, confusion evident. He remarked that Hendrik seemed to have aged drastically overnight, now appearing to be in his mid-30s. Hendrik, baffled, confirmed that he was indeed in his 30s, pointing out that Edward himself seemed to be speaking as though he had stepped out of the past. Edward dismissed the idea that he could be mistaken about something as simple as age, then looked around at the others, noting the unfamiliar faces among the knights. Turning back, he asked for the current year. When he was told it was the year 1666, he processed it calmly, concluding with unsettling ease that his future self must have lost his memories. A faint smile formed on his lips as he realized the truth. 7 years had passed. Shock rippled through the knights. Later, as the camp settled, a knight brought Louise a warm drink, asking her to wait while preparations were completed. She accepted quietly, still processing everything that had happened. Nearby, Edward watched her closely. He took in every detail, the color of her eyes, the way her hair caught the light, the presence of the sword at her side. Something about her stirred recognition deep within him. He called out to her, using a name he had not spoken in years. She looked up. He asked if she was from Cavan, or if she had ever visited it as a child. She answered that she had, recalling the festival she had attended long ago. That was enough. He stepped closer, asking if she had once saved a boy there, one with black hair. As realization dawned across her face, he closed the distance between them, his voice softening with something almost disbelieving. At last, he wondered if he had finally succeeded in finding her. And as that thought settled, a faint blush rose to his face, his expression brightening with unmistakable joy. Louise questioned Edward about whether or not he tried to find her before. The warmth of Edward's smile lingered as he spoke, the joy in his expression still fresh as he admitted that he had, in fact, tried to find her all those years ago. He explained how he had searched using the cufflinks he had given her, even going as far as putting up posters throughout Kavan and the surrounding villages, yet no answer had ever come. Louise quietly filled in the gap he could not see, recounting what had happened on her end during that time, allowing the past to settle into place between them. Hearing it, Edward accepted it with ease, remarking that things had turned out in an unexpected way, and observing with a lightness that they now stood as a knight and a mage, a pairing he found rather fitting. That single word lingered, catching Louise off guard. A mage. The idea didn't align with the Edward she knew, the man who had only ever seemed to use magic sparingly, as though it were something secondary rather than intrinsic. Before she could press further, Maxion stepped in, his interruption firm and deliberate, warning Edward against revealing anything more. The sudden restraint puzzled Edward, who questioned it openly, even going so far as to challenge the logic behind hiding the truth from someone who was supposedly his lover. Maxion clarified, with visible reluctance, that Louise knew nothing of Edward's identity as a mage, nor of several other truths that had been deliberately kept from her. Edward's curiosity sharpened instantly, and with disarming casualness, he voiced one of those hidden truths outright, referring to the usurpation of the throne as though it were a simple matter of fact. The words struck Louise like a physical blow, her composure faltering as disbelief overtook her. She turned to Maxion for confirmation, only to be met with his weary silence, the truth written plainly in his reaction. In that moment, the weight of everything they had concealed settled heavily on her, leaving no room for doubt. The scene shifted as Edward and Maxion moved through the forest, examining the aftermath of the dark magic. Edward noted that the entire surrounding area had been an illusion, a distortion born from the same force that had consumed the village. Maxion reasoned that even the forest itself had likely fallen within the territory affected by that magic. What remained in its wake painted a grim picture: horses that had wandered in alongside them, and villagers who had not been fully consumed, yet whose minds had not survived intact. Maxion resolved to send them all to Serbenia's nursing home, trusting its care above that of the temple or the imperial facilities. Edward accepted this without hesitation, though Maxion could not ignore the subtle dissonance in him. 7 years ago, Serbenia had only just begun to distance itself from them, yet now Edward spoke of it with confidence. Maxion explained the changes that had taken place over those years, the improvements that had extended patients' lives, attributing the knowledge to Edward's own prior orders. Edward took this in with a faint, amused realization that perhaps his future self had not been entirely consumed by romance, though Maxion quietly corrected that notion as well, revealing that the relationship between him and Louise had never been genuine, but rather a contract born of circumstance. That revelation startled Edward more than anything before it. Unable to accept it at face value, he insisted on hearing the truth directly from Louise. His curiosity piqued rather than deterred. Time passed as the knights completed their tasks and resumed their journey, eventually heading toward Bailey Village. The road was calm for several days, the tension of the previous ordeal giving way to a deceptive peace. As evening approached on the 5th day, Edward called for a halt near a river, recognizing it as their last suitable place to camp. The knights moved swiftly to set up their tents and prepare the bonfire, falling into routine with practiced ease. Amidst this, Edward approached Louise, who sat alone in the wagon. He greeted her gently, but the hesitation in her response did not escape him. Her unease showed plainly, and when he asked, she admitted that it felt strange addressing him as she always had. He seemed different, too different, and the things she had learned about him only deepened that sense of distance. Edward considered this, acknowledging that it was only natural. From his perspective, she was still a stranger, and being addressed so familiarly felt just as unnatural to him. The word struck her harder than expected. Stranger. Even as he treated her kindly, Even as the past connected them, the present version of him did not know her at all. Sensing the gap between them, Edward offered a compromise, suggesting she call him by his middle name, Elliot, the name he had used when they first met. Until his memories returned, it felt more appropriate. Louise accepted this quietly, the name settling into place with a strange familiarity. Their conversation drifted into more uncertain territory as Edward admitted, almost casually, that he had always assumed he would fall in love with her. The sincerity of it made her falter, though she tried to rationalize it away, insisting that it was only because she had left a strong impression on him. Edward countered this with ease, pointing out how love could begin from the smallest of moments, offering an example from the palace staff before reflecting, with a soft smile and a faint blush, that perhaps his feelings had begun the very day they first met. Louise met this with a quiet smile of her own, deflecting the weight of his words by reminding him that the man he had become had not fallen in love with her when they met again as adults. That, more than anything, seemed to amuse him, and he shifted the conversation back to the present, asking her to explain how their supposed relationship had come to be. As they walked through the forest, Louise recounted everything in detail, from their first encounter on the outskirts of the capital to the events that had bound them together, including the swordsmanship tournament. Edward listened closely, his thoughts briefly drifting to the sword she carried, recalling the promise tied to it and the unresolved threads it represented. Even so, he returned to the present when Louise voiced the question that weighed most heavily on her, whether his plan to usurp the throne was true. Edward confirmed it without hesitation. In doing so, he also came to understand why his future self had kept her in the dark. If she remained by his side, she would inevitably be drawn into conflict, especially given her ties to someone aligned with the Emperor. Louise absorbed this in silence, the implications unfolding in her mind, the realization that this path could lead to irreversible consequences. With that, she chose to end the conversation for the night, stating that she needed time to think and excusing herself. Edward watched her go, surprised by the sudden distance, and questioned whether she truly intended to remain alone. She explained that, as the only woman among them, she had chosen this arrangement herself, and that he had previously accepted it. That answer seemed to satisfy him, though the meaning behind his faint smile remained unclear to her. Then, without warning, he stepped closer, closing the space between them in a way that caught her off guard. Instinctively, she raised her hands to cover his mouth, her face flushing as he spoke, teasingly suggesting that perhaps he should start calling her by a more familiar name. She hurried to stop him, insisting that his memories would return soon and that he should not act this way. But he only responded by gently taking her hand and pressing it against his cheek, his gaze soft yet intent as he asked her not to look only for the Edward she knew, but to allow herself to experience this version of him as well. And as she stood there, caught between the past and the present, unable to fully reconcile the man before her with the one she had come to know, a quiet, bewildered thought surfaced. She could no longer understand how things had come to unfold this way. The following day unfolded under a quiet afternoon sky, with Edward, Louise, and Hendrik walking together through the camp as the lingering calm of their journey settled around them. Hendrik remarked that it had been a long time since he had been able to enjoy a peaceful meal, his tone light in contrast to the tension they had recently endured. In that same moment, Edward casually snapped his fingers, and something behind them suddenly gave way with a sharp break before collapsing. The noise drew both Louise and Hendrik to turn back in surprise, only to realize that the fallen structure was Louise's tent. Hendrik quickly assessed the situation, noting that this would pose a problem and that they would have no choice but to adjust their arrangements for the time being. Edward followed with an observation that the weather seemed just as unfortunate, remarking with an easy smile that it looked like rain would arrive that very night. Before Louise could fully process what had happened, Edward concluded that there was no other option. She would have to share a tent with him. The statement hit her immediately, and she turned toward him in shock, repeating the implication in disbelief. Edward pointed out the simple truth that she was the only one who had been using a tent alone, and while she hesitated, flustered and unsure, he asked plainly whether she objected. Caught between circumstance and her own unease, she sighed and conceded that it could not be helped. By nightfall, the rain came heavily, drumming against the tents as Louise moved all of her belongings into Edward's space. Inside, she stood with visible tension, still unsettled by the arrangement, questioning whether she was truly expected to share the tent with him from that point onward. Edward acknowledged the situation as something strange, even unfortunate, yet the faint smile on his face betrayed a quiet satisfaction that did not go unnoticed. Louise studied him carefully, suspicion creeping into her thoughts as she tried to reconcile his outward composure with what she knew lay beneath. She remembered the version of him from only days before, the one burdened with anxiety and confusion, the one who, at 20, had already been forced to part with the people he loved and lose everything to unjust circumstances. Trying to steady herself, she reasoned aloud that sharing the tent would at least make it easier to respond if anything happened, offering her help in case of an emergency. Her words seemed to surprise him slightly, but instead of addressing that, he returned to his earlier teasing tone, asking again whether he should call her by a more familiar title. She refused outright, only for him to push further, questioning her reaction and pointing out that he had seen her struggling with her thoughts. As he stepped closer and leaned in, she reacted instinctively, covering his mouth with her hand to stop him. He only responded by remarking on her shyness, taking her hand and placing it against his cheek, drawing another flustered reaction from her. With quiet insistence, he told her not to look only for the man she knew, but to allow herself to experience this version of him as well. Releasing her, he stepped away as if nothing had happened, announcing that he would change first and even teasing that she could join him if she intended to sneak a look, suggesting it might be her only chance. The comment left her completely flustered, her face burning as she quickly insisted she would not look. Unable to settle, Louise later found herself outside the tent, sitting by the bonfire instead. The rain had not deterred her from seeking distance, and she admitted to herself that there was no way she could sleep inside under those circumstances. She kept the fire alive, focusing on its warmth while her thoughts drifted back to his teasing words, the way he had insisted on calling her something more intimate. Lost in that recollection, she was startled when he approached her without warning, asking why she was not inside and reminding her that it was time to rest. She deflected, insisting that he should sleep alone, and that being older, she would give up her place without issue. Edward dismissed the concern, stating that he had no intention of intruding and that he would remain awake as he often did. She questioned whether he had always struggled with sleep, and he confirmed that it seemed to persist even after 7 years, suggesting that the effects of erasing his memories had left lasting consequences. As he added more wood to the fire, Louise watched him in silence, unable to find the right words. In the end, she chose to remain with him, deciding that they would stay awake together through the night. Edward pointed out that it would be more practical for at least one of them to rest, but she countered with her own reasoning that sometimes an inefficient choice led to better results. If she stayed awake that night, she reasoned, exhaustion would likely give her the courage to sleep beside him the next evening. Her answer drew a quiet smile from him, his acknowledgement simple as he remarked on her wisdom. The following evening proved her right. Exhausted from the sleepless night, she fell asleep inside the tent without resistance, while Edward remained awake beside her, unable to take his eyes off her as she slept. The morning that followed carried a familiar rhythm between them, their interactions echoing something that had already begun to settle into place. Their journey continued, and at last they reached Bailey Village. The scene that greeted them was strikingly orderly and vibrant, with large houses topped by roofs of green, blue, and orange, and villagers gathering to watch their arrival with curiosity and excitement. Whispers spread among them, speculation rising that knights from the capital had been sent by the emperor himself, their presence seen as a sign that the village's reputation had reached far beyond its borders. Edward observed it all with quiet calculation, noting internally that it rivaled the state Serbenia had once reached. Maxian reported that he had scouted the outskirts and found no trace of dark magic, suggesting that this location might not be connected to the incident they had been investigating. Before the moment could settle, a white-haired woman stumbled directly in front of them, dropping the basket she carried and scattering its contents across the ground. Edward reacted immediately, dismounting to help her, asking if she was injured as he steadied her. She assured him she was fine, but his attention had already shifted to the objects she had dropped, spheres that immediately caught his interest. The village chief approached with laughter, explaining that Edward had noticed the village's specialty, memory-collecting vessels. He spoke proudly of an incident that had occurred months earlier, describing how a blessing from the moon had descended upon them, granting ordinary villagers the ability to create these spheres. Each person who received the blessing would find one beside them upon waking, instinctively knowing how to store and replay memories within it. Edward questioned the nature of such magic, recognizing it as something advanced, yet the chief insisted that none of them were magicians, only ordinary people blessed by faith. The explanation only deepened Edward's interest, and with a grin, he expressed his own devotion, asking whether he might receive the same blessing. The chief eagerly assured him that he could, explaining that within a week, another opportunity would arise, and suggesting that Edward's participation would lend legitimacy to their claims. Yet as he spoke, his eyes shifted unnaturally to green, his smile carrying an unsettling undertone. That night, as the village settled into quiet, Louise found herself unable to sleep. She stepped outside, stretching as she tried to ease the restlessness in her body. The absence of Edward's presence weighed on her more than she expected, and she realized that, after only a few days, she had grown accustomed to being near him. Lying alone had left her unsettled, unable to find rest. Hoping that physical exertion might help, she set out toward an open area she had noticed earlier. As she moved through the village, a familiar scent caught her attention, the unmistakable fragrance of roses. It stopped her in her tracks, but as she followed it, she realized there was something more to it, something wrong beneath the sweetness. The scent deepened, and soon the truth revealed itself. Blood stained the ground ahead, spreading across the path in stark contrast to the quiet village. At the center of it stood Edward. Two bodies lay at his feet, lifeless, their blood pooling beneath them, and he remained there, unmoving, as though caught between moments. When he sensed her presence, he turned, his face marked with streaks of blood, his expression carrying a coldness that sent a chill through her. Louise called his name, uncertain, almost disbelieving, as the reality of what she was seeing settled in. That he was the one who had killed them. The scene rewinds to before the incident, revealing Edward and the knights staying within a refined lodge, its calm atmosphere sharply contrasting what is to come. Standing by his window, Edward gazes outside with a composed expression, yet his mind is already calculating. His eyes pick out not just the two assassins watching him directly, but more, figures stationed across the street, bringing the total to 7. As he processes this, his thoughts align everything that has happened: the return of his sealed memories, the emergence of memory crystals, and the reappearance of an assassin he had once encountered. Each piece connects too neatly, forming what he recognizes as a carefully orchestrated plan. Whether the attackers intend to eliminate him outright or extract critical information through the crystal no longer matters to him. Either way, the situation has unfolded exactly as needed. Without hesitation, he opens the window and leaps out. Below, the assassins surge forward, rushing to intercept him, while Edward, rather than alarmed, feels a sense of familiarity, almost relief, at the returning tension he once lived with daily. The narrative briefly shifts further back, to a conversation earlier in the lodge between Edward and Maxion. As they analyze the broader situation, Maxion questions whether the Emperor himself is behind these events. Edward affirms this suspicion, explaining that while the Emperor assigned them 3 tasks, he deliberately excluded the Serbenia case, despite its clear similarities to another recent incident. If the matters were truly unrelated, that exclusion would make sense, but because they are so alike, the omission itself becomes suspicious. Edward reasons that the Emperor intended for them to seek his help regarding Serbenia, thereby placing Serbenia in his debt and creating a political excuse to summon them to the capital. Maxion builds on this, recalling the mirror building influenced by black magic, where anyone who escaped would lose their memories. It strikes him as inconsistent that the emperor could detect such magic, yet remain ignorant of the Serbenia case. From this contradiction, he concludes that the imperial family must be collaborating with practitioners of black magic. Edward does not fully deny this, but instead suggests the plan feels too intricate for the emperor alone, implying the existence of a more capable mastermind, one with the resources to infiltrate devout regions like Bailey Village and Serbenia, and the wealth to continuously supply magic stones. As Maxion processes this, realization dawns, and he identifies the likely force behind it all: the temple. The story then snaps back to the present confrontation, with Edward mid-descent from the window. As he falls, he snaps his fingers, releasing a surge of magic from the room behind him that cushions his landing and momentarily shocks the approaching assassins. Even as he lands, his thoughts remain focused, noting that scouting the area earlier had been wise, as he now needs time to establish a barrier. But before he can act, a yellow magical aura suddenly ensnares him. Caught off guard, he is bound tightly, unable to move. An assassin steps forward, revealing that they had anticipated his actions. Recognizing the voice, Edward calmly identifies the man as Count Effalante. The Count, smiling, remarks that he has spent 7 years recovering from the injuries Edward inflicted before, and wastes no time in grabbing Edward's hair and pressing a dagger to his throat. Edward's response is cold and dismissive. With sheer force and magic, he breaks free of the restraint, forcing Effalante back in shock. He questions whether the Count is not curious about his former lord, but the assassins are already panicking, unable to comprehend how Edward is wielding magic. In an instant, Edward lifts all of them into the air, leaving Effalante trembling. Edward acknowledges the Count's new position as vice-captain, while Effalante bitterly credits his rise to the Emperor's elimination of those who once stood above him. Edward's silence speaks volumes, before he coldly states that sparing the Count before had been a mistake. He should have delivered his corpse as a warning instead. With that, Edward tightens his magic. The assassins' bodies are crushed, blood spilling as they collapse lifeless to the ground. Only Effalante remains suspended. Even in his final moments, the Count spits venom, calling Edward an illegitimate child born of the Empress's affair, condemning the former imperial family as rotten and proclaiming loyalty to the current emperor. Edward responds without hesitation, crushing him completely, leaving his body to fall lifeless alongside the others. In the aftermath, Edward stands alone among the corpses. He lifts his blood-stained hand to his hair, only then noticing its uncontrollable trembling. His thoughts turn inward, realizing that he has grown unaccustomed to this brutality after days of relative calm. What once defined his everyday existence now feels disturbingly unfamiliar. He urges himself to clear the area quickly, but before he can proceed, a vision overtakes him, one of his sealed memories resurfacing. He sees his butler desperately urging him to survive, to escape, to live on and restore their honor. The desperation in the memory shakes him, and he recognizes that the sensations he buried for 7 years are returning vividly: the deaths of those who sacrificed themselves for him, and the suffocating feeling of standing atop countless corpses. The narrative returns to the present, where Louise stands before him, frozen in shock at the sight of the bodies surrounding him. Though their forms are mangled beyond recognition, their clothing makes it clear they were no ordinary individuals. Edward, regaining composure, apologizes for exposing her to such a scene and states that he will clean everything up. But Louise, rather than dwelling on the horror, steps forward and takes hold of him, telling him that explanations can wait. What matters now is him. She insists on checking for injuries, questioning whether he might have broken something, and even when he claims to be unharmed, she demands he raise his arm so she can be sure. Edward hesitates, then asks her directly whether she feels no fear toward him, insisting that everything that happened is his fault. As his trembling hand rises to her face, Louise responds not with fear, but with a gentle smile. Drawing from her past in perils, she explains that she has seen far worse, living among beasts driven mad for over 20 years. In her mind, she recalls how those creatures, though terrifying, were ultimately pitiful, trembling after losing the one who once guided them. To her, they were the weakest of beings, and she recognizes the same fragility now in Edward's heart. She tells him not to torment himself, because no matter how much he dwells on the deaths, those who are gone will not return. When Edward asks what he should do, how he can escape these memories, she answers simply that he cannot. There is no escape, only endurance. The only way forward is to continue living, layering new memories over the old, just as he has done for the past 7 years. Her words catch him off guard. Then, without resistance, he lowers his head onto her shoulder, admitting that it feels heavy and that he needs a moment to rest. And Louise allows it, holding him as the two stand together amidst the aftermath.
Please make sure to subscribe. Special thanks to all of my Patreon members. Why not watch another Manhwa recap on my channel by clicking on this video right here?